We are here. Hola.
We made it.
All good.
All right. I think I'm going to welcome everybody to our next panel at CTN. Fraser, I'm going to let you take it away from here.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to all the organizers at CTN. And thank you to Tina for staging this amazing Revive and Thrive thing, like an entire 7 days of let's pretend coronavirus hasn't changed things around. So I want to introduce everybody. This is a panel all about the abiding importance and enduring power of layout. So I want to introduce you to our stellar panel this morning, starting with my almost fellow countryman, James Williams. James, would you like to introduce yourself, list some of the things you've worked on?
Yes, so my name's James Williams. I have worked with Fraser on a film called Space Jam 1,001 years ago. And then since then, I've worked at DreamWorks on Prince of Egypt and Road to El Dorado, which apparently is a well-known film. I also have worked at Sony. I worked on a number of their films, recently on the Spider-Verse film. And then I moved to Blue Sky and I worked on a film called Spies in Disguise with a dear friend of mine who happens to be on this panel as well, Tom Humber.
That's a great segue through to the very wonderful Mr. Tom Humber, who's in our Brady Bunch window further down.
Well, hi, I'm Tom Humber. I'm an industry veteran of about 35 years. Fraser and I actually first worked together at we were Amblimation. And then I was down to Disney, Florida for about 11 years, working on Lion King, Lilo and Stitch, Mulan. And then the last 16 years, I've been at Blue Sky Studios, which suddenly is Disney again. And then worked with James on Spies in Disguise. That was the last production we were on so far.
And I think that will take us through to Armen as a segue, because I believe you were also at Amblin in London around about, yeah? No, yes?
Yes,
but more recently on Klaus and, ladies and gentlemen, Armen Melkonian.
Yes, thank you. Yes, my name is Armen Melkonian. Yes, it's true. I did want to reveal that I worked on a movie like a million years ago, but yes, it was the American Tale 2. We worked in London for Amblin Studio, and yeah, I have worked with these gentlemen, some of them on and off. Of course, worked in DreamWorks on pretty much the first 6-7 features, from Prince of Egypt to Shark's Tale, you know, and then I moved on to Sony. Worked on a couple of their projects, you know, which was, the first one was what was it? Something season?
Open season.
Open season. Sorry, it's just so many titles. I forget. Just so many titles. And then Surf's Up, and you know, then I moved out of Los Angeles, and I worked on the Canadian production over here. And the last project I worked on was in Spain for Sergio Pablo's studio for Klaus. And currently I'm just directing a series that's going to be aired for Netflix. So yeah, it's been very busy. I'm not going to bother you on all the titles that I've been working on. It's just too long. So.
Thank you. And that leads us, I'm going to introduce Scott Capel next, because Scott introduced me to Armen to invite you to be part of the panel for this. So Scott has worked at Disney, Pixar, also was involved in Klaus, and Scott helped me in the research and with one of the illustrations for the book that came out 10 years ago, Setting the Scene, Art and Evolution of Animation Layout. So Scott is joining us today from Canada, from just north of Toronto. Scott, welcome. Oh, you're muted.
You're muted, Scott.
Scott, you're muted.
There. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that was because I guess coming into the new meeting from the green room, I didn't realize I had to unmute. Anyway, hi everybody. Yes, okay. And thank you, Fraser, and thank you, Tina and CTN for you know doing all the great work that you guys have been doing over the years. So basically, my thing was, you know, yeah, started in Canada, went to Sheridan. First, I guess, job out of the gate was Rock and Rule, you know, at Nelvana, okay, which might ring a few bells. Then I had, by a great wonderful fluke, I ended up making a little sidestep into effects animation for a couple of years at ILM, and that ended up meaning working on a few films like Raiders of the Lost Ark and Star Trek II, and there was a couple others in there. Anyway, and then back to Canada, and it was like a lot of freelance. I've kind of bounced around between, you know, freelance and studios. Then it was when I went to Bluth. When Bluth went to Ireland, I joined them there and worked on that slew of films they did over there. And let's see, after that, it was back to Canada. And then Disney called, basically, so it was down to Disney for a few years on, you know, several of the pictures like Hunchback and Mulan and Tarzan and Atlantis and Fantasia. And then I, again, by another great fluke, there seemed to be a lot of these flukes, you know, it was just, I got to go up to Pixar and work on Incredibles. You know, I was there for 3 years. And then it was back to Canada and pretty much freelance since then. I've had a couple of studio gigs, but it's been mostly freelance for people like Armen, Blue Sky, Pixar a little bit, and it's been film work, TV work, game work, you know, stuff like, well, things like Horton Hears a Who and Ferdinand. Did a little bit of work on Arthur Christmas, and, you know, it just, etc. Oh, and I guess the last big thing that I, again, would have helped a little bit with was Klaus. I was involved with Klaus a couple of years ago, but not really doing much of anything at the moment. Just trying to pursue new avenues. You know how it goes. You know,
and also you've done a lot of teaching. You've taught at Sheridan, and you have a really great.
There's been a lot of teaching in there. I should say that. That's what I have been doing. Can I cite places like
sure.
CGMA and Academy of Art U? You know, I've been teaching for those guys a lot, and I did a lot of work, a lot of teaching for Sheridan. In the last 10 years, but I'm not really out there anymore. So
well, thank you very much for.
Anyway,
thank you very much for joining.
You know, take it to the next person.
Last but by no means least, Ron Martin and myself first met at CTN, and one of the key things during the research process for the book about layout was the disappearance of the physical camera, and it was a really difficult period to be trying to introduce people to the idea of lens language or camera-ready artwork. We're all old enough to have remembered the whole process of having to prepare something to be shot on a rostrum camera. But of course, with the arrival of the digital toolkits in the 1990s, we're now in a world, and this is very much Ron's current territory at Unity, where we have these fantastic real-time render systems which are closing even more tightly the gap between live action movie making and animation and visual effects. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce you to Ron Martin from Unity.
Thanks very much. You know, my career started in fine arts and, did a postgraduate degree at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, where Silicon Graphics 2040W or some huge computer showed up, and another gentleman who my esteemed panelists may remember, John Cars, was in my class, and there really, you know, came a time where it was like, well, build your own class. You know, there was my academic advisor at the time was a gentleman named Daniel Potvin, who had gone to Sheridan and studied computer animation. And he really encouraged us to push this computer system as far as we could. Unfortunately, we didn't have any way of actually getting the frames off the computer, so we would be taking slides. Now, this is 1989, so it was a little early. And obviously the college was at the time wondering what it had gotten itself into with this behemoth of a room heater. But interestingly enough, I had jumped both into production and into software and helping companies like Softimage, Microsoft, Avid, getting into the animation production mindset was where I really found a sweet spot. You know, the opportunity to teach and use my my education background at University of Toronto and the Ontario College of Art, and then at the NAD Center in Montreal, you know, it became almost like a system where I would work with a technology company for a while, and then I would go back into production. Some of the animation production was at Mainframe Entertainment in Vancouver. A company called Media Principia, which was in Vancouver. It was owned by the former founder of Softimage, Daniel Langlois. And then up to Ubisoft, where in the early 2000s, you know, this concept of real-time storytelling started to play out. And that's where I worked on as director of cinematics. You know, we did Rainbow Six 3, which is a Tom Clancy squad-based shooter game. And then this other, you know, marvelous franchise called The Prince of Persia. And from that point, I went out to EA and worked on some Marvel superhero cinematics for a fighting game, and then hopped around a little bit more, and then went back into visual effects, working for Digital Domain, and you know, some years there, and then up to Atlanta. And in Atlanta, I actually worked with some friends to create I guess a little haven for art and artists, a makerspace called Mass Collective. And then after leaving Atlanta for this great opportunity, we were doing all sorts of AR and VR and, you know, a lot of films in 360 experimentation. And then I got a call from some old friends of mine who had been working at Unity, and they invited me to come out and work with them to develop and build out an animation and film approach for real-time 3D engines to get into linear entertainment, including animation and film. And it's been an incredible ride. It's really wild.
That's great.
Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. I want to sort of topple off that whole question about camera work and lenses and go back over to James. You and I both came into the industry in the UK you started off training as a camera operator. What was your first production experience where all of the camera work was effectively being done digitally, and how did you find the transition from preparation of artwork and scenes for a physical camera to having everything digitized?
Interesting question. One of the things that people have to remember, of course, is that there was always, to a certain degree, a virtual camera, because the layout artists themselves would draw the lens. You know, we would shoot with an actual physical lens on a rostrum camera, but the lens that we shot really was independent of the lens that was presented to the audience, you know, so the wonderful layout artists would be able to draw in all the perspective that you would have. So what was interesting about it is I actually started more as a rostrum camera operator and then as a traditional layout artist. And so there was a lot of learning to the process. I understand how physical lenses work because I was working with a physical camera all the time, but then to really move into the world of virtual cameras. The first movie where that was really all I did was a film called Polar Express, which I did, some of you might have seen.
And that was a collaboration. It was a Warner Brothers movie, but you were doing that at Sony ImageWorks as a kind of feeder studio.
Exactly. And there was a wonderful cinematographer by the name of Robert Presley, who was working on that project as a consultant, working with Robert Zemeckis. So it was Robert Zemeckis and Robert Presley who were there, and they just come off working on Castaway. And so the great thing was I was able to, on a daily basis, talk with a live action cinematographer and really talk about the type of lenses and the type of cameras that we would use. So I'd say that was really the transitional period for me. And it was very useful to actually have a transitional period, not just from traditional animation into CG animation, but traditional animation into CG animation almost via a live action background that I experienced through that process. So I think that gave me a great deal of sort of insight into the type of choices that, of course, 2D layout artists had been making for, you know, many decades. But it really cemented for me that it's the 2D process is very much an intellectual process. It's not a practical process where you're really absorbing what lenses would do and then drawing it. That this new process was a very immersive process for me, because now actually I was physically in the set, because of course on that film we were able to use handheld cameras, so we were actually able to move through the set and actually make decisions fairly in real time, which was quite early for the process, really. Obviously the wonderful work that Ron is doing right now with Unity is you know, light years ahead of that. But yeah, that was my baptism.
And that was also something that was developed even further on Surf's Up.
Yes. Well, Armen and I worked very briefly together on Surf's Up, and that was really our, you know, thought throughout that process, which was to come up with a camera language that was very much a documentary style. And always there was an idea that, you know, Armen and I would always think about how would this actually be shot, rather than just thinking about the image itself. And I think that's part of the process of really immersing yourself now into a process which is much closer to a live action process, is really remembering where you are physically standing as a cinematographer when the images are being captured.
I'd like to ask Armen, when I came to Madrid in 2018, while Klaus was still in production, Matthew Teban kindly invited me to come and talk to the crew about the book and about layout. One of the young team got in touch and said, yeah, but we tended to feel that we weren't necessarily the most important people in the building until you came in and did the cheerleading thing. And then it was like, yeah, we matter in this process. But the recruiting was, I understand, kind of difficult, because there were so few people who were being trained. I mean, it's still not really part of the curriculum on a lot of animation courses. I understand that a lot of the people that became the layout and background crew on Klaus were already working, but they were in the games industry as concept artists. Would that be accurate? Or?
Yeah, I would say pretty much all of them. We had some veterans that I had worked with all the way from DreamWorks days, but most of them were just young illustrators who somehow found themselves in animation. It's like a yin yang thing, because even though they didn't have any experience about filmmaking, that actually was a plus for me, because they were all eager to learn, and that pool was not polluted. You know what I mean? So everybody was open to learn new stuff, and they were, excuse me, they were very young and very eager and incredibly talented, and that was something that I looked at like a glass half full, you know, and I just embraced it. And the best thing was that Sergio had given up on the layout and the merit that we are going to make it to the end. He even told me, I'm not optimistic about us meeting the deadline. And I saw the crew, and it was, for me, it was like, with this pool of talent, you can do anything you want. So I just jumped right in and start training them about the basics of cinematography. Forget about the traditional layouts. Just start focusing on what matters. You're not doing illustration, because that was a problem, that they were looking at each shot as illustration. And I start changing that mind, trying to steer them into thinking more like, you're telling a story. This is a sequence. This sequence belongs into an episode, and so on and so forth, right? So you have to start working that way. And like I said, they were young, and just very open to learning, and that was the main success. Why we managed to meet the deadline with the quality that we saw on screen. So I don't know if that answers the question.
It truly is you know, when it was released a year ago and people began talking about it, you know, the first day that people were able to access it on Netflix, it was just this tidal wave of, oh my God, you have to see this movie and you've got to go, and like every frame of it is done so beautifully. But a lot of people are unaware of the fact that that was how Snow White was made. You know, there were no layout or background. There wasn't anybody with that skill. So a lot of the traditional illustrators like Ferdinand Horvath and Gustav Tenggren and all these people that were brought in, they were book illustrators, and they had to learn cinematography and lens language in the 1930s. I want to ask Tom, one of the things that you're working at the moment at Blue Sky in set design, one of the things I'm always keen to communicate to students about the process of designing environments for animated characters is that largely what you're doing is creating framing devices for the action that takes place in that particular location at that particular moment. Do you find that, since your career also spans traditional hand-drawn animation and digital work, that the transition into the digital environment brought back a kind of more literal thinking about an actual space? You build the space, you move the camera around in it. Do you find that you have to stretch things, move things, erase things to create clarity, spaces against which the characters can read? Or
No, I mean, I think all the principles are the same, except with the 3D environment, because you're always still setting the stage for the characters, just like you were back in analog. The one thing I found when I transitioned from 2D animation into the CG world was the job of the layout artist got split in two, because it's now half the art department and half the layout department, which deals with the cameras, and you're basically shooting the sets that we've designed, but the principles are the same. We're creating a set that supports the characters, it supports the story. I mean, you want the world to have its history, to have its story, but you can't let, just like you said, we're like Armen was saying, we're composing for film. We're not doing, and not every shot's an illustration. Not every shot is meant to be lingered on and looked at. So your set can't overpower your story or your character. So we're looking at the same things. What I like is that I like the dimensional aspect of it. I love the fact that it's not being shot flat on a rostrum, and we're not just looking at, we can actually get into the world and play with it. And I really enjoyed that aspect of it. But yeah, I mean, the principles are the same. Am I answering your question?
yeah, absolutely. It also, it makes me wonder also, Ron, when you mentioned Prince of Persia. When I was doing the research on the book, I was talking to Lee Unkrich at Pixar about camera language, because early on there was a kind of sense that giving a gamer a camera to carry through the world, that this was influencing movie making camera language, because people were experiencing an animated world with animated characters, but no cuts, no edits. Right. So this is very, very present in the whole conversation going on just now about VR and real time. Do you find that some understanding of traditional Walter Murch editorial continuity still applies, or are we just in different territory? Is this theater rather than cinema?
I think that we're really focusing on creating a cinematic experience in games. We have started to understand, and there's a romanticism about it, you know, here we have an interactive landscape, you know, in front of us, and are we using everything in that frame, you know? And it's not only a question of economy, you know, of what kind of effects or what kind of story comes out of, you know, the interaction, but it's also, you know, this concept of, you know, really drawing the character in, you know, and being and having an empathy with that character. So the language is so rich, you know, we lean so heavily on cinematic language.
Talking about cinematic language, one of the things that one of my favorite moments in the history of the book, sorry to keep going back to the book, particularly when it's not available, when it was launched, one of the first place that we talked about it was the Bradford Animation Festival in the UK, and they had a budget. They've since morphed into the Manchester Animation Festival, but they had a budget to bring one person from London and one person from overseas, and I invited Scott to be one of those people, and the other guy was Roy Nesbitt, and Scott had never met Roy Nesbitt, who was one of, everybody said to me, you can't put a book together on animation layout if you don't talk to Roy first. So he was the first guy I interviewed. And buying beer and putting it on the table in front of Scott and Roy was one of the great moments of my life. But Roy is quite remarkable in his approach to how he creates and bends perspective. Would you be able to say something, because I know perspective is a big part of what you include in your classes on layout, Scott. So do you want to, we talked about camera, framing, how much of a role does perspective play in storytelling?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that Roy just drank me under the table, like no questions asked. So, there was no keeping up with him there. Which was great, actually. But well, yes, it was great. It was really a lot of fun being able to come over to Bradford and meet you and Roy and attend the festival, and then we went down to Bournemouth and kind of did a little dog and pony show of the same thing, and all the kids down there, etc. It was great. And there was that train trip actually, either there or on the way back to London. I can't remember.
We were taken by train from Bradford down to Bournemouth. And the other thing in Bournemouth was that we had a lecture theatre full of 200 students who were kind of there under duress because they came into the room not thinking layout was sexy. And then we couldn't empty the room. There was another class coming in and there was just a line of people. And you and Roy were like rock stars. I remember you projecting one of the drawings, the perspective of Notre Dame from Hunchback.
Oh, right.
Just after we had projected the drawing of the Golden City that took 6 months for, you were pointing out that in amongst the gargoyles, you'd included Goofy and Mickey and Donald and all this. But at that scale, people were looking at the artwork and just going, oh my God. And you guys kind of went, you were like the Jagger and Richards of layout on that day.
Well, I mean, what can I say? But there, a couple of things. Number one would be to address the business of perspective, like hand-drawn perspective, let's say, versus like what you get out of a CG environment. A little preamble, perhaps. I want to say that I'm probably going to be the one here who's going to be probably banging the drum for 2D drawing or 2D animation the most, because I've never really let go of it. I still very much am working 2D, and I never really made the leap to CG, to 3D. To this day, I mean, I've used SketchUp a little bit. On Klaus, we were having to use Blender. I just couldn't figure it out. And we've been going for like what, maybe 15 years now with, or longer with, animation is definitely a CG medium. And, we went through all that entire, period of time when it was like, like a lot of people just either just, fell off the edge of the iceberg or scrambled up onto it, and made them, and retrained themselves and, got into the industry that way. And, I mean, there's some been amazing things done as a result. But I have found that I still end up pretty much in my teaching, I'm just relying on drawing and just, telling everyone, well, I mean, yeah, like CG is great, et cetera, but you really owe it to yourselves to, try and train yourselves as draftsmen first, and all the things that go with that, right? Just learning, visual language, like just becoming aware of things, going to galleries, watching movies, all that stuff, which of course, is, you know, important in any artistic pursuit. I think everybody has to widen their, you know, horizons as much as possible. But I mean, what would I say? I still find I'm a bit freer just working on a piece of paper, you know, than anything else. Let's see.
One of the things that I included in the little promo montage that I did, I had one of your drawings of Notre Dame next to one of the drawings that you did for Wall-E. And when you were doing stuff on The Incredibles, the contrast between the medieval architecture of France through to the mid-century modern of suburban America for The Incredibles, you also have to be pretty knowledgeable about design and art history if you're going to be a storyteller in movie making.
Yeah, well, I think that goes without saying. I mean, you know, you really have to, I think, as part of your journey through your whole career, is you're trying to, like, you know, learn as many things as possible, you know, about art. And, you know, and of course, then that just is some stuff that, like, once you've absorbed as much of that as you possibly can, you know, it comes out in your work, like, no matter what you're doing, whether it's, you know, traditional or CG, or whether it's, you know, whether you're doing layout or any of the other, you know, or animation or whatever. But yeah, I don't know, but just to maybe specifically address, yeah, like when you said Hunchback, I mean, obviously it worked for me, because I really enjoyed medieval architecture and medieval history. So, you know, I was just drawing cathedrals all day was just like, you know, it was wonderful. And yeah, the other thing of, you know, as it was done in those days, you know, like we were doing all our layouts again, traditionally, and the workbooking, the whole workbooking process where you're going from storyboarding to layout. And that's kind of where the cinematography was being done. Yeah, I mean, that I found like really pleasurable, and it was like it was good to do. A little sidebar to that, sorry?
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I didn't mean to
interrupt. A little sidebar to that. What Tom said about, you know, the idea of CG having split the layout team into sort of an art department and I forgot how you termed it, but a CG department. Of course, my experience anyway at Disney was that, yeah, we were very much an art department, and then they had the scene planning department, which was kind of, you know, different from us. But of course, we worked very closely with them, or at least as much as we possibly could. You know, like you would do the art, you'd kind of plan something out, you get this wacky layout with a, you know, a crazy pan going on, and then you'd kind of like put the field guides over it and kind of, you know, say A, B, start, stop, and then go, okay, that kind of looks okay. And then you show it to your supervisor and he goes, okay, sure. And then you send it off to scene planning. And then, you know, a couple of days later, you get a call from, Tom Baker.
Tom Baker.
And he said, come on down, have a look. So you go down and you kind of look at it and then, okay, well, that kind of worked. I do remember there was one time when I did one and it worked the first time. And I went, oh, I know what I'm doing, you know, a little bit at least. And, but you know, there would be that iteration process of, you know, going over and over again. And that was just very enjoyable. And the thing of, you know, being able to sort of craft that, the strange, well, let's say the strange viewpoint, like, you know, doing something which involved going from, you know, wide angle to a telephoto shot in like one scene. Yeah, it was that was obviously a lot of fun. Now, I also just want to mention, you know, when you say rock stars, I mean, you know, I feel like I'm nothing compared to the men who went before us, right? You know, like those guys like Don Griffith and
Ken O'Connor.
Ken O'Connor. I still have to say, I'm sorry, I hope I'm not taking up too much time, but just a specific reference. I mean, I think we'd all agree with this. You know, the big one that's always pointed out is that one from Peter Pan. It's the flyover of London and off to, you know, Neverland. And I mean, as a result of teaching, I've like shown that one a lot of times. And of course, you know, looked at it many times, and, you know, you go in and you sort of try and pick it apart. And it's amazing how subtle that is. And I would like to know, and here's the other thing, there's a lot of stuff that I've never really, I've not talked to a lot of people. I've not talked to a lot of old guys or I didn't go to the ARL as much as I should have when I was at Disney. But I mean, I would like to know just how much of that scene or sequence was the product of, just Ken, or was Ken working with camera guys? And, would he go down to the multiplane camera and like?
I believe there was a lot of dialogue.
I mean, it's got to be a collaboration. And
when
that's
I interviewed Bill
this is
Persia,
actually one of the things about the whole career is collaboration, meeting the people, the friends you make, the things that happen because you're working together. It's just, of course, it's irreplaceable.
I want to pick up on what you were saying about workbook and ask Tom, the relationship between storyboarding and layout this is a question I get asked all the time by students and by teachers and people who know more about character animation perhaps than they do about the scenic side of things. Do you have any particular thoughts after all these years about, in the same way that there's a dynamic, important relationship between layout and scene planning, just what the relationship is between layout and storyboard? I would throw that question out to everybody, but start with Tom.
Well, layout and storyboard, and you're talking about workbook. Workbook is like the bridge between layout and storyboard, because if you think about it, the storyboard artist is trying to communicate an idea. They're communicating the story. They're not so worried about the logistics or sometimes screen direction. And if over a schedule you have several storyboard artists work on a storyboard, you'll get a different vibe, a different feel. So the workbook is kind of the first step to kind of breaking that down, kind of solving it, putting it into film language, getting your cameras on the right side of the line. You start deciding what your compositions are going to be. Because like I say, the storyboard artist is communicating the idea and the emotion. They're not always, some storyboard artists are draftsmen, some aren't, but they're always communicating the idea. And now you start to solve and figure out how to communicate that idea to the audience. And then that allows the layout artist to know what they are about, how their cameras are going to work and what their plan is going to be. It's basically the blueprint for the layout department. Would you guys agree?
Absolutely.
James unmuted himself. Okay, Tom, carry on. But give us a description of a difference between a 2D one and a 3D one.
Oh my goodness. Well, I mean, I haven't done a workbook. See, I did camera. I was in the layout department for 4 years here, but I've been in the art department for 12. So I think James could probably speak better.
I was going to say, actually, Armen, I would love to hear his experience about it. Funnily enough, Armen and I, of course, I was in scene planning when Armen was in layout. So we worked, that collaboration that you were talking about, Scott, between the two departments, where one is a more technical executable process and then the other one is the creates the art itself. But Armen, please, I'd love to hear your answer to that one.
I'll try to keep it brief. The thing about workbook is that I didn't know what workbook was until I arrived in DreamWorks. They said, okay, here's the storyboard. We want you to do workbook so we can give it to layout. I'm like, what's that about? Because every other features, not that many that I worked before Prince of Egypt, was basically we did the workbook and the layout at the same time. It wasn't divided up. So then I kind of start to understand why the process is there, just because you have to share the work to many other artists, right? I mean, you as an experienced layout, as a senior layout artist, do understand what is needed from the boards and how you have to make it much more cinematic. And you don't have time to go and clean it up, which means that you're doing it in smaller scale. And then that gets translated to a larger scale drawing by a layout artist. So in a way, I thought that that's kind of I don't want to say demean the work of a layout artist, but it was already all processed and ready for them just to basically execute. So creatively, I didn't think that was that much more involved for the layout artist, because you're doing all the thinking in the workbook stage. So that was new to me. Now, moving on to the CG world, right? I mean, I don't know if it was Scott, I think, who was saying that it's a learning process. Everything you learn actually becomes a tool to use for the next medium, which was a CG. And I honestly believe that all the training I had in classical layout, which means we really actually had to think about the lens. We drew the lenses. You know, the directors say, I want wide lens, I want a long lens. And for Prince of Egypt, it was kind of a challenging because the art director said, I want you to use like 190 millimeter lens. Nobody can understand what that means, right? So you have to super cheat the principle of perspective, right? We have to actually break the rules to make that happen because you're creating compressed images. I don't know if anyone knows, we had style there that was very smart. Egypt was all in compressed lens, and everything else was done with a much more normal lens, like 35, 55 millimeter. I'm talking drawing it, right? We are not talking about actually clicking the lens on a virtual camera and dropping it. So it was a subconscious choice, which I thought really worked well. Now, when you go into CG layout, I believe that Previz is actually what is the workbook of the classical layout that we used to do. Previz artists would be basically blocking the shots, choosing the lensing, choosing the angles, so that, and editing it. In a way, we are editors in certain level as well. So all of a sudden, the responsibility of layout from a 2D to 3D just doubled, you know, because now you have to be even more conscious of your mapping the lens and mapping your camera and how it's gonna work. And a lot of people, I don't think, have that training in animation, unfortunately, because when I started working in live action for Third Floor on live action films, I start to realize that now you're constrained with 3 lenses. You can't just willy-nilly choose any lens you want. So then the less you have, the more creative you are with your lenses. So in a way, I think workbook, what it used to be, is now today's Previz. And for some studios, you have a Previz senior artist who blocks the shots and give it to layout artists to process it. And I believe that was what was going on with the Disney School of Thinking, that we will do the workbook and then we'll give it to layout artists to process. But now I'm starting to see that some studios are skipping that, and it's just the layout artist who has to do the blocking, planning, lensing, always straight to deliverable to animation. So that, I think, is the transition where we went from 2D to 3D. And when I went to Spain, this was the first time that they were trying to, I'm talking about the studio, not ever. This was the first time they were trying to hybrid the two together. And the 3D department and the 2D department was like oil and water. They had no idea how they were supposed to collaborate. And, you know, that's why I had to delegate the work and make them understand how they're gonna be, you know, a part of the team. So School of Thinking, if you actually translate it to what the source of it is, then the artist will be able to perform better. I don't know if this is helping. You know,
Yeah,
what I'm trying to
am I
explain.
right in thinking that there was a department at Sergio's studio called Down and Dirty?
Well,
Down and Dirty is actually the one stage that warms up the plate for workbook. But honestly, the Down and Dirty, I don't think is a luxury that I don't think any studio has anymore because of the timeline we have to produce this kind of work. I think there are very few studios that do Down and Dirty now.
I can respond to that a little bit because that's what I did on the show. I didn't actually get to do any layout. I was hired to actually help with the Down and Dirty process. So
you want to describe a little bit about what was covered by Down and what was covered by Dirty?
Well, yes, okay. Well, basically, you just simply went in and did a pass over the storyboard, which of course was already amazing. You know, in many cases, in that film, you know, everything was pretty sorted out. But there was always like stuff, you know, like you have to, you know, there's a little bit, you know, something to do with continuity. I remember it was I worked on that sequence where the letter, you know, falls out of the bag and blows in front of Klaus, and then Klaus picks up the letter, and you know, that's his ooh-ah moment, right? And it was this issue about the size of his fingers and the size of the paper. And of course, in the storyboard, it was like changing from panel to panel. So, you know, that was a thing where the way the process worked, we just basically drew new scenes or panels over the storyboard, and then just, you know, rendered out a new version of the animatic, because that's how it was done. But and sometimes it got, you know, it got into do like what's in the background, and of course, you know, that got complicated because you're trying to compose something in your background, but at the same time, you know, or you say, okay, the camera's from here, so that barn must be back behind him. So you stick the barn back where it's supposed to be, but then suddenly you've got a composition problem. I mean, that seems to me to be the, like, I haven't got experience in this. I mean, even though I've worked on a few CG shows, I haven't actually been the layout guy. And I'm going, well, wait a minute. I mean, surely you must be doing a lot of shoving stuff around, just like we do in 2D, in order to, like, you know, make the scene work. But yeah, that was an issue there. But anyway, it worked fairly well. But as Armen says, it was a bit of a luxury. They had decided to do it to try and, you know, aid the layout department. But actually, by the time I got off the show, that they were just shoving stuff right through the layout, right?
If I may say so, Scott, down dirty usually takes more than one artist to do a down dirty. I don't know where the term came from, by the way.
No,
okay?
but
it's a weird term. But the thing is that down dirty is supposed to be a collaborative effort by more than one artist. They're supposed to brainstorm, and not just everything Scott just explained, but you know, what I have to say is Tom is right. Storyboard artist's responsibility is not to worry about the lensing or cinematic or the screen direction. They're supposed to just tell the story, just like a, you know, rough version of it. And then it's up to the layout artist. Well, you know, I mean, theoretically, it's the layout artist who has to take the narrative that they have drawn and throw in the cinematic pass on it. That is what down and dirty is. The board artists are gonna mess up the scale, mess up the screen direction. They're gonna mess up, and when I say mess up, it's not in a derogatory way. I'm saying it. That's not their job. Their job is just to tell a story. Our job is to basically take that and make it epic, make the cinematic language apply to it. One of the example, one of the very simple example I can come up with, and I think James may remember, is that the one of the sequences in Prince of Egypt, when there was Seti's reprimand, the way it was bordered by Kelly was that everything was basically drawn like an animator would draw, right? Everything was like basically where I am right now. Like I'm talking, and then you cut to the, you know, the other two in the shot. And then it came to us, and then I said, you know, let's punch this up. So we drew them this small against a massive environment, right? Because when he was reprimanding them, we wanted to show his massive statue in the back to put that additional pressure visually on those two tiny characters, right? And that was a complete steering off from the boards. Like we just kind of said, we get the narrative, now let's throw in the cinematic pass, which actually upset the animation director. He goes, what are you doing? Like you created the character this small on the screen, and I wanted it to be like big because that's where the acting comes from. And the idea was, no, you know, sometimes the environment has to do the part of the acting, and that's what makes the cinematic experience that much more pleasurable. So that was the down and dirty, and that was something that we then immediately translated into workbook, because those were the ideas that we came from. That what I just demonstrated here was that try to steer off from the boards and come up with something that's much more closer to the narrative instead of just talking heads. And that was basically the process of coming up with ideas so that not only that one shot is epic, but it also flows through the sequence. So that process of thinking was called down and dirty, which then was immediately translated into workbook. And then it went into layout, and the rest is just the process that everything goes through. So that is what I was trying to just, you know, bring it to a table. That's what it's supposed to be. And all of this was new to me because before DreamWorks, I was doing all of that anyways, right? But now it was not segmented into departments and process.
Right.
I'd like, just before we start getting to some of the Q&A that's come in while you guys have been kindly sharing your knowledge experience, I just want to ask Ron, in the context of the work that you're doing just now with Unity, do you find that I've been very aware since March of the people checking to see within the industry where things are, the animation and visual effects sector has remained buoyant because the idea of remote working or virtual practice is not freaking people out, but it is having a significant impact in live action, just at the point where with movies like The Mandalorian, Mandalorian and all this other, just people are finally comfortable with this as part of a kind of movie maker's toolkit. What are the conversations that you're tuning into in any of the different contexts where Unity is currently active about this transition period with coronavirus?
Right. So, I've always said, real-time engines and the real-time, construction of a scene, has these elements or skills of people that have worked in games, so I've seen a lot of people transition between different entities without having to leave their home. So obviously, having more exposure to the technology has really improved, the business. But what I see a lot of is people thinking, okay, it's going to be real time, so I'll be able to make more. But what it really is it affords you an opportunity to look at what you're doing in a fully lit scene, in a fully textured scene. And instead of doing more, you have more aspects of iteration that can come through. So you're actually doing more better work than you are perhaps saying, I'm just going to try to get more done, and I think it's really given a lot of people an opportunity to collaborate as well. We're looking at things together and we're interpreting in real time. We think in real time. Why can't we talk about it, and show things and be more effective? And camera is in the language of cinema, it just gives you so much more opportunity to look at what it is and why it might not be working and fix that.
This was the 1950s version of it. This is one of the Lady and the Tramp architectural miniatures,
right,
where they actually, you can see the stand-in for the animal and human characters, where they wanted to know that house and they wanted to know it from the dog's eye perspective. Yeah. So and you can see the guy, like the scale of this, the guy shirt in the background hanging there. But when I look at those images from that early kind of, balsa wood and glue thing, and you look at what is now possible, you just think, oh man, this is such a liberating thing.
And as James can attest to, once you start getting this into VR and these other manners of working, you really have an appreciation for scale. Yeah. Whereas if we're just looking at a frame, or we're just, it's interesting. And Fraser, you and I have talked at length about that feeling of immersion that going to a cinema brings you. And what happens when, we change that and we just put it as a moving frame on, a picture frame on the wall. We've lost a little bit of that feeling of immersion. But it's interesting when you're working in VR or you're in an immersive environment, how a lot of that comes back, and you're virtually location scouting, or you're blocking in real time and looking for things that connect the viewer to the characters and the space.
When we talked about this recently, I was quoting Jorge Gutierrez and his experience when they were doing Son of Jaguar, and it was his first VR animated experience, and he got so far into it, and suddenly the light went on, and he went, "This is theater. This is promenade theater. I don't have to be limited in my thinking about it as a cinematic thing, because it works as a physical experience, like in Proscenium Arch, except you get to explore the world. There's nowhere you can't go." We have 90 minutes, so we've got a little bit of time solely for a Q&A and for other things, but I just want to we have some questions in from a couple of different people. I want to start with a question from Ashley Thomas. Hi, Ashley. What advice would you guys give to layout or previs artists going into the industry now? What should we know going into this part of the pipeline that you wish you had known when you were going into it first? Do you want to take that, James, to start?
Well, it's funny because I think Armen was touching on it a little bit before about the whole storytelling process. It's understanding that it's not creating a succession of images. You know, there's always this idea that what we're trying to do in cinematics and cinematography is to create beautiful images. And that's really not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is make sure that we convey the story, we convey what's going on, we convey what the characters feel about what's going on, and also we convey what experience we want the audience to have in the process. So it's incredibly important for anybody going into the industry to really be fluent in the language of cinema, to understand what lenses, what camera positions, what ways of cutting, what ways of blocking have been used for, you know, the last century to convey a story, to basically tell the story visually. So be very, very fluent in that language first. It's more important to be fluent in that language than it is to be fluent in whatever tool you're using. You know, you can teach somebody a tool, but it's much, much harder to teach somebody how to tell stories through images. So I would say, watch as many movies as you can. Find the movies that you love, watch them again and again and again, switch off the sound, watch how it was made. Exactly, you know, turn off the color, do everything that you can so you can focus on the way in which the story was told. It's very much like if you know, if you read a novel and you want to understand how did that make me burst into tears, you can break it down. You can see how the structure, the sentence structure, the way in which ideas were brought in, that's how it works. So I would say the main thing is be fluent in that language.
I would say,
and yeah.
Go make your own movies. Just go make some movies.
Yeah, make movies. Yeah, yeah. Be fluent in the language, and then realize it's still it's one thing to read the language; it's another thing to speak it. Like any language that you learn, you know, you can read it on the page and you can understand how it's put together, but then you realize to convey the idea is very, very hard. So then make as many movies as you can, and don't worry about coming.
If you have one of these, you are a movie maker.
Yeah,
because the resolution and the apps that you have in a Samsung or an iPhone or any portable device, the image resolution is higher than broadcast quality was when James and I came into the industry back in the Steam age. And you can use free software to capture, manipulate, and edit, and also distribute what you actually do and get feedback from people. So there are none of the economic obstacles. This has been a very democratizing technology for becoming a movie maker. You don't need anybody's permission. I think that's an important thing to...
Absolutely.
It's a loaded question as well, because you can't just give one advice that's going to cover all the angles. I agree with everything that James said. I agree with what Scott said about just don't limit yourself to cinema. Go to galleries, you know, look at graphic novels, see what works for you, what talks with you, and then you know, see why that is the case. And also, absolutely learn about camera. You know, before I went to DreamWorks, I didn't know much about certain aspects of cinematography. Thanks that DreamWorks gave us opportunity to have these personal lectures with Bruce Block, who is amazing. You know, he opened our eyes about composition and how that works. Instead of drawing pretty pictures, what you're actually doing is you're helping the narrative, creating a mood. And when the lenses came into the picture, we start to understand how lenses can change your emotion, how you're looking at a picture. So it's very difficult to give one answer to that question. It's a universe that you have to learn. and it's ever expanding. It's never constrained. It's an expanding universe. The more you learn, the more you realize you know nothing. The more you kind of, it's an ongoing process. I'm sorry to give that answer, but it's an ongoing process. You will never reach that moon. No matter how fast and hard you run towards it, you'll never get there, and that's the joy, that you are constantly learning.
Yeah, every movie you make, when the film is finished and you look at it on the screen, you go, I can do better. And
the films are never finished, they're just released.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that is very true.
Tom, do you have any recommendations, going back to that particular part of the question from Ashley, about something that you would say to your younger self about this whole process that you think they would value at the beginning of a career in this side of the industry?
I mean, it's everything we were just talking about. It's just like, I would study more. I would lean in more. I would draw more. It's just, everything is more. You're always, because you're always striving. You're like Armen says, you're always going to be striving. You're always going to be learning. So whether it's digging into cinema, whether it's life drawing, because it goes back to like fundamentals. No matter if it's CG, those are the tools. Everything's foundation. Everything is fundamentals. And that, just more. The big thing for me was actually, when I was young, I was really influenced by animated film. But then when I started to find the interest in live action film, when I got old enough to kind of discover things like Lawrence of Arabia and realize that there was something different going on the screen, something big, expansive, and just every image was crafted to tell that story. And that's the kind of thing that any young artist should be looking at. And that's what we're talking about, diving into the cinematics. To get specific, one of the big things for me with animation was the relationship to film noir. No matter what you're working in, I always look, you either look at Eisenstein, German Expressionism, or the film noir. And what I like about the film noir is it was done for a budget. It was very spare. They showed what they needed to show to make the point. And that's the kind of thing you need to look at before you start hanging all the bells and whistles, beautiful props, beautiful world building and stuff like that. Because film noir kind of strips it down to what you need to tell the story. And that's the kind of thing I think you need to be looking at the most.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I would just like to throw in, because I loved what Tom was going to say. I think one of the sad situations that I have now is finding how few movies a lot of young people are watching these days, particularly, pre-2000. Yeah, Lawrence of Arabia for a lot of people is an old movie. Armen can remember, when Prince of Egypt was made, there were ideas from Citizen Kane that were brought in there, and you could do that because everybody had seen Citizen Kane.
Yes.
So it was like, oh yeah, we're going to use that particular scene from Citizen Kane as an example. And these days, it's very hard to find people who've actually seen it. I would say,
Right.
When you are learning this, you have to read, just like if you're doing English, you read the classics, you go back to Dickens, you go back to Shakespeare. You have to do the same thing with filmmaking.
Hard reading. Yeah,
exactly.
When you get into the old black and whites that are still around, that are still relevant today, they're relevant and around for a reason, because they were told. It's like, I've always loved Casablanca. And I had the opportunity, it was always in my head, I love this movie. But then I had the opportunity to go and see it at AMC theaters. I'm used to watching it at home on my TV, and I was like, this is a great film. Saw it in a theater setting, and my appreciation and respect, I thought I loved it. It went through the roof because you were isolated with that. And
I was like that with West Side Story. I'd only ever seen West Side Story on an old TV in pan and scan in black and white. And in 1984, they had a re-release, a new print of it. And I went to see it in Glasgow, and I just sat there and went, oh my God. I mean, even the title sequence, which is just color fields, was so overwhelming. And then more recently, through the amazing documentary that Dan Rame and Patrick Mattei made about Harold Michelson and Lillian Michelson, Harold was one of the storyboard artists on West Side Story, on Fiddler on the Roof, on all these different things. And one of the guys who worked on 101 Dalmatians, Ray Aragon, was one of the storyboard artists uncredited on Norman Jewison's In the Heat of the Night. So all these people that were making these movies that we grew up with were steeped in that. And I think the film noir thing that's important also is grayscale values, because one of these things that I find myself trying to encourage people to look at so much is light over dark, dark over light. Very, very fundamental stuff, but far easier to digest if you're familiar with the film noir period.
Right.
When we were young, we used to squint our eyes. Now all we have to do is take off our glasses.
Exactly.
And,
That's right. Yeah.
Exactly. Like right now, none of you are in focus to me.
I have another question
Now,
from.
can I just address the thing about what was it? It was things that we did as our younger selves.
What you would say to your younger self.
Oh, well, that's a bit different. Because what I'm going to say is that we inhabited a very different world, and that's obviously come out in the last few responses. When we were going through the same time period, when we were like, just beginning to get into all this and get excited by things. I mean, what were the retrieval systems? What were the ways of accessing the good stuff? Yeah, we had television, maybe second-run theaters, right? But I mean, apart from that, and now, well, look at what is available to young people today, and the stuff that's out there, the stuff that's being produced, the stuff that they have access to. I mean, how they keep up with it, I don't know. But I mean, and now we're asking them on top of that to make sure that they've seen everything that was done in the history of cinematography over the last 80 years,
But to tell you the truth, Scott, that's easy, because as you say, in our day, the only thing we could do is run to a theater and watch it once.
Well, it was easy for us in a way, but I mean, on the other hand, I wish I'd done more at the time. But yeah.
We have a question from Justine Nicole Sanchez, and maybe Ron, you would like to pick up on this. Has our collective concept of what makes good cinematography changed much over the decades? Would you say it's difficult to innovate?
If not at all. I don't think it's I don't think it's a innovation. I mean, it's just, gosh, you can move the camera anywhere, but it's more along the lines of, does it make sense? Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And one of the biggest point, like, I mean, look at Nouvelle Vague, you look at the French New Wave cinema, and, Godard with his little, 16 millimeter handheld, doing nothing crazy, but just pointing it differently and asking people to look at it differently, and I think that what we're seeing, we look at films that have been produced using this virtual art department or this concept of, VR, and, the biggest one that was made, to date was probably, the Lion King. And then you look at shot by shot for the original and you're like, well, yeah, you did it, and it's beautiful, but you did it. And I just so romanticized, and I keep coming back to this because, when we talk about drawing and we talk about framework and how we're getting closer to the cinematic CG world, and it's just like, you have to understand what you're drawing and what you're asking the camera to do, and the computer is just a tool, it's all about your story. And it's all about your relationship to that story.
Yeah, I would say it's communicating an idea always. And the fact about innovation is there's always the shock value for an innovative process. It's whether you're doing Stravinsky's The Firebird, or you're writing, Ulysses, or you're shooting a movie for the first time using a technique that nobody's seen before. The worry there is always, am I communicating the idea? And also, is my technique now overpowering the narrative of the film? So often we'll use classical styles, just like we'll write a sentence, which is the same sentence that we would have written 5 generations ago, because that's the easiest way in which we can communicate a specific idea. We're not trying to get between the audience and the idea. We're trying to help where the way in which the idea is conveyed to the audience. So if I want to make the audience really feel for a character and really understand that character, I might choose a particular camera position or a camera lens to convey that idea. I don't want to necessarily innovate if that innovation becomes the thing about the shot. I want it always to be about the story. But what happens as well is people out there innovate, an experimental idea comes out, and then that idea ends up being absorbed into the new language of cinema. You know, the language of cinema evolves. We're using techniques and camera angles, and we can cross the line, and we can do all kinds of things these days because the audience themselves are keeping up. They understand that language now. And once they understand the language and the language itself becomes innate to them, we can now use those ideas without worrying that it's going to, you know, draw or distract the audience from the intention of the scene.
I have to keep a promise to Chema Gonzalez, who's joined us from Costa Rica. As, he has a couple of questions about El Dorado, the road to El Dorado. And this is an interesting thing because actually over the course of everybody's careers, the movies that you experience as a member of the crew and your recollection of the production of the movie, sometimes what people in the audience find in a movie is a surprise to the people that worked on the movie. But Chema has asked, how do you manage to establish the pre-Columbian city and the road to El Dorado, and how do you break down the abstraction of the pre-Columbian look and feel and put that into the architecture? I know that's possibly more like a scenic design thing or an art direction thing.
Well, actually, I was going to say Armen and I should, you know, I should throw the ball over to Armen because, as I say, at that stage, I was actually the scene planning supervisor on the movie, so I would inherit a lot of the ideas. But Armen was one of the key layout artists on that movie, so he can talk to that. But I know there was a tremendous amount of exploration and a tremendous amount of design work. Years before the movie starts, you will have designers and you will have directors and you'll have art directors out there reading and going on field trips and really absorbing the world. But Armen, I'll pass that one over to you, my friend, because I know
the credit for that goes to the art department. It was many different artists collaboratively trying to
and many different directors, can I say?
But it's funny that you're saying El Dorado is popular in some parts of the world because many people over here don't, like, you know, people that I work with, they don't even know what that movie is. They haven't seen it. They don't have any knowledge of it. But going back to the question, the visuals was something that was a collaborative effort by different masterful artists, and they actually worked together under the direction of different directors. It was very tough task, but they did come up with a style that everybody was on board with. Once that was locked in and coined, then it was passed to layout, and then we had to find a way to take that style and put it into different perspective. Again, these are days when you didn't have a convenience of dropping the camera in a 3D set. So it was a back and forth. We would draw it in workbook. We would show it to the artists who came up with the style and see if it kind of jived with the way they were imagining it. And it was a lot of back and forth. And then when it went into layout, it was even, it was actually more different than Prince of Egypt because that style had to continue being consistent throughout the film. So I would say, yeah, it actually probably was one of the most laborious animated feature that DreamWorks made, simply because of the style of the show. So I would say the answer to that question is it was merely the art department. The layout department just basically executed it, you know, the best we could.
Yeah,
I've got, sorry, go ahead, James, yeah.
No, I was just going to say one quick thing. What was interesting for me working on that film as well is that it was such a departure from Prince of Egypt. Prince of Egypt was a film that had a much more impressionistic backgrounds. And of course, the color palette was very different. On Prince of Egypt, it was a much more muted color palette to represent the deserts. And the difficulty that I think we all had on working on El Dorado is that the palette was so vibrant, the backgrounds were so present, you know, the reds and the greens and the jungle elements, it was always hard to make sure that the characters actually, you know, were readable. Yeah.
It's true.
I have two questions that I would like to kind of combine. They cover similar territory. So the first question that we received was from Justin Ramos asking, are jobs with well-known IPs good for people trying to break into the industry? We have a related question from Melissa Massingil. I hope I'm pronouncing Massingil correctly. Thank you for doing this panel. Once we've started studying art and film language, how would you recommend developing the technical skills and knowledge required for layout, lenses and stuff? Buying a camera, using Maya? What do you look for in a reel for somebody wanting to be a CG layout artist?
Wow, that's another loaded question.
Oh, don't ask me. Again, I would say, go back to this thing. Start with this thing right here.
So the question, could you just go over the last part about the Maya? Like,
how would you recommend developing the technical skills and knowledge required for layout about lenses? Would it be through a physical camera, through using a program like Maya? What would you be looking for in a reel that somebody would want to come in as a CG layout?
I would still say, go, digital SLR, replaceable lenses, do something with one of those. Just good photography.
If I may jump in here for a second, I think that one thing that I didn't have access to when I started layouts was, knowledge of cinematography. So there are very great books out there. One of them is the Traces of Cinematography. I mean, it can be a boring read, but if you want to understand camera and how it's used in live action, it's a very good start. It's a good start to understand how to use a camera. My take would be, it would have been a luxury if you could have worked on some 2D classical films to understand lens by drawing it and understanding what the challenges are. Because when you go into the CG world, the fact that you have that easy access to the camera, you can tend to be irresponsible with it because you're just using any lens that Maya offers. Maya offers 32.5 millimeter lens, which actually doesn't exist. So, you have to understand that in real world, you're constrained to maybe a handful of lenses at best. And the less you have, the more creative you become. So I would say definitely understand what the camera functions are and how the lenses work. And then if you read some books, you understand why lenses are applied to what situations and how it can change your perception of the image that you're looking at. That's a good way to start. Once you get that, then understand lighting, how light works and how light changes the narrative on screen. Once you get to understand that, the most important is composition. Once you understand composition and the lighting and the lensing, you're halfway there. It sounds easy, but it's a lot of work to just get to that point. I hope. Yeah.
No, sorry,
Go ahead, James. No, please.
Well, one of the parts of the question was, what would we like to see? And I'm sure Armen would agree with this. One of the things is people think about layout or they think about cinematography and they always think about the movement of the camera. They always think, oh, wow, wasn't that good cinematography because that was a really complex camera move? Some of the most magnificent cinematography that we see can be from a static camera, can be from a conversation between two individuals. Because the main thing is to understand inherently what the scene is about and then make sure that you convey that through the compositions that you have. So if you're going to show Armen or I anything, we need to see it in context. I don't want to see one shot. I want to see the scene. I want to see the scene playing out, and I want to be able to understand it and feel it and really understand what the vision of that scene is. It really is. I want to be transported. I want to be able to see a sequence where I'm watching a story unfold. And if I am moved by the story and understand the story, then I can go back in and see how you did it. But if I can get to that point where I just watched something and I went, that was well told, then I know that you are on the way to being a good layout artist.
Can I ask Tom, when you've been at Blue Sky now for quite a long time, so presumably you've been around at a lot of portfolio and reel reviews, or is that something that's always handled by particularly recruiters, or do you department by department look specifically at reels or folios that get sent in?
We dip in and look, and one of the things we find in the art department, we see a lot of portfolios. This is getting away from layout and camera a little bit, but the one thing we find is we find a lot of finish, we find a lot of flash, like a lot of polish, and then but once you dig under, foundation is kind of weak sometimes. And that's what I find a lot of. Everybody kind of digs into the tools. They start playing with the digital, all the CG and the flash. And like James is saying about, big flashy camera moves, somebody thinking that's cinema. And we get the same thing in the art department, a lot of flash, but then the underdrawing isn't there. It's, look at Andrew Loomis, look at Golden Age of illustrators, things like that.
And look at the world you live in. I find often that if I ask students to design an environment, they will go to reference from the internet, but they won't look out of the window or walk down the street. I'm trying to encourage people to have a sketchbook with them so that if they see an interesting architectural contrast or an interesting lighting effect, that they would sketch that quickly with something that they have in their pocket. And a lot of people are doing more plein air work with an iPad and doing that digitally, but I think people forget that sketchbook work is as important for scenic and environment design as it is. I think people tend to get very obsessed with figure drawing and gesture drawing, and it's all about the character animation, but actually 3-point perspective, really understanding just the basics is something that you take in through observation, not just through research online or in books.
We used to say that, composition was really about the lens. And, when I used to teach, I'd say, well, drawing is, a lesson in seeing. It's just like, take the time to understand, why things feel closer and why colors and composition, classic composition, 5 C's of composition. It's just where things are and in perspective to where you are as a viewer, and how does that make, you really feel. And it's just put yourself in different places too, like break that norm, go do something different. Make yourself feel uneasy by going someplace, that you haven't been, like the library, like just try something.
We have 10 minutes left before we're due to wrap up. I have one question remaining from Melissa Massengill, and I want to give you guys also an opportunity in your answer to throw in anything that we've not talked about that you feel is important. But Melissa's question is, how do the panelists see layout evolving in the future? In AR, VR, and video games and shorts like Glenn Keane's Duet that give the viewer so much freedom, how does the artist guide the eye in that context? And is there a role for layout in these pieces with more free-moving cameras? Who would like to begin?
Well, I'll just say that short format is one of the most difficult, real storytelling, processes, and experimental shorts, aside, you start out and the duration based on, again, the economy of your story. And I think that there's a really, challenging aspect to working and laying out, and sometimes having to do all the jobs yourself. But it's there. You just have to learn it.
Okay, so the question was, what are we thinking of maybe is going to happen in terms of layout, et cetera, in the future with like new ways of making movies, et cetera, VR and so on. It's interesting because I remember a long time ago, there was an interview with George Lucas in somewhere, and he said, well, you've got 2 things. You've got movies, which basically are a passive form of storytelling. Like you were the audience, you just take in the story and that, as presented by the film. And then gaming, which is more interactive. And then it's a different thing because you go, the player goes in expecting to be able to be interactive and control the story. And I think that's a very interesting thing. I mean, like, we've just gone through another iteration of 3D and some technology which, provided, a lot of possibility, or like the possibility for the audience to interact with like how the story was told. I'm not so sure it was completely successful. Like all that stuff that Google was doing, the Spotlight show series. Now, some of them are very good, but when I went in with the tool, using the tool, which allowed me to see the film from any angle, I just got confused. I didn't know what to do. I mean, or, you just kind of go in and you go, yeah, hey, let's just, let's see if I can break this thing, Yeah, I mean, that's my take on it, is that, we're going into some definitely uncharted territory, things that, where audiences have never been before. And I suppose it'll sort itself out. Some wonderful things will be done, but I think that's my answer to that question.
James, do you have a thought?
Well, my thought about it is that everybody thinks about all of this as innovative, and obviously the tools themselves are technologically innovative, but the experiences really are the experiences that we've been having for hundreds of years. You think about the VR experience. The VR experience is obviously much more immersive, and the person experiencing it can move around and they have a lot more freedom potentially. But if you think about layout, layout was an expression that grew out of architectural design in many respects, and architectural design is all about building 3D spaces. So people who were designing St. Paul's Cathedral or Salisbury Cathedral or the Colosseum in Rome, they were all thinking about how that space would affect the people that walked through the door from different perspectives. So there was a thought to the emotional experience going through, and that's what people will be doing in VR today. It will be less directed and less focused on specific compositions, but they still have to think about the space that the audience will inhabit. So I don't think this is ideas that haven't been trodden before. And just like we will always go back to, the great artists of the past for different ways of telling stories. We'll look at how stories were told, 30, 50, 100 years ago. You can look at how environments were planned and designed hundreds of years ago, and the same rules apply. It's like, how do you want the audience to feel? That's a massive question. When you build an environment in VR, that is going to be at the forefront of your mind. So I think, these tools just allow us to experience things in maybe different ways, but really the experience itself is one that we've been having since we've been on the planet.
Go ahead, Ron.
I was just going to say, there's a lovely piece done by Randall Okita, and it's called the Book of Distance, and it's a VR story about 3 generations. For a 3rd generation Japanese immigrant into Canada, and God, it's so great, and it's great because it's like going to a play, like going to, and the lighting and the sound.
There's a link in the chat section if anybody wants to check this out, the Book of Distance.
Oh,
sorry.
It's fantastic. So, and I think it's on Steam.
Okay.
In the final moments, can I just get each one of you guys to put out a little bit of advice to anybody that's considering this as a career path? Can I start with you, Tom?
Just like everything we've been talking about, just get out there and do it. Just, the tools are there. The tools have come to you. There's no reason not to explore and do things. That's about what comes to mind. Just get out there and do it.
Cool. And Armen?
I think all the gentlemen here have covered most of it, except that I would say, if you look at this more of a passion rather than career, it will be much easier because it's almost like the Matrix, where you take the blue pill and a red pill. Once you take one direction and you want to stay the course, you really have to be true to the art to be able to enjoy it. And if you don't enjoy it, then I would say you're basically in a wrong track. And I do entirely agree with Ron. You know, we have so much technology now that can help us convey an idea much easier than we ever had before. And as far as the uncharted territory goes, whichever the technology goes, I think that if you stay to the basics and the why you are in it and how you're telling the story, then you will be able to maintain it until the end. That's just my advice.
Scott, what would be your advice, Pete?
I like that layout. You just gotta love it. You just, you know, you just gotta be the type that just can't stay away from it, you know. But a thing that has kind of cropped up in a lot of the teaching that I've done recently is people being afraid to maybe go out and copy stuff that they really like. I mean, so, you know, if there's something out you really, I mean, and that's the way it was done. You were apprenticed to a master and you sat there for years and just did copies of his work. And eventually you would become
artists when you came into the
master. But it's like people seem to be afraid that they're going to get dinged if they go and copy something. Now, sure, you can't present it as your own work, but I mean, if there's a movie you like, you know, copy it. You know, make a little, you know, your own version of it and see what's making it work. Like that's what copying will do. It will unlock, you know, some of the secrets that are going on in there. Yeah, I've been saying that to people a lot recently. You know, just
what would you
copy the painting? If it's a film, just do a little shot by shot, something or other. However you do it, you know. So okay, that's what I would say.
Very cool, Ron. What would your closing advice be?
Oh, I just love lenses, you know, and it's just, for me, it's just like, you know, you look at the masters, cinematographers, or these people that we've learned so much from, you know, with two lenses, you know, and you just say to yourself, it's just like, go make a movie with, try just two, see what you get, you know, take it to the extent, you know, learn about it by making mistakes and make a lot of them, you know. And as everyone said, we've just been picking these things up and waving them around, you know. This guy, Adam Smith, made an app which uses augmented reality. It's called Previz Pro, and it's for the iPad. And it uses real time, it uses Unity, and you can actually storyboard your film in AR and go to locations, you know, and try shooting stuff and lining it up. And it uses the physical location with their CG character in front. I mean, it's so fun to think of how to tell your story, you know, just tell it, you know, get it out there, and don't be afraid to show people. Gosh, it's like so fun when people talk to you about it.
We're out of time, and we have another session coming in behind. I just want to give one last word to James, and before I hand over to James, I want to thank Tom Humber, Scott Caple, Armen Melkonian, Ron Martin. I want to thank Tina Price and all the CTN organizers. I want to thank all of the people who took time this afternoon to join us and to ask questions. Thank you all for sitting in on this. Final word to James.
This is going to be a hard one. I would just say everything that everybody said, please take down. The main thing is realize there are no shortcuts. The main thing, the reason why we're all here is we ate, slept this process, that we think about films and we make films. And even when we're not making films, we're talking about films, even after 30 years in the industry. And if we're not talking about them or making them, we're watching them. You know, we all have, you know, people that would rather we talk to them, but you know, this is our passion, exactly what everybody was saying. Be passionate about it. If you're not passionate about it, if you want to get into this because you think it's cool, you're going in for the wrong reasons. You go in because you have to, because it's all you want to think about.
Well, thank you guys very, very much. Thanks to everybody who's joined us. And yeah, hopefully see you guys again at some other festival, some other event. But thank you for taking this opportunity to celebrate, share all the things that you love about layout, cinematography for animation, and a big thank you to everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fraser.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. Thanks.
Take care.
All right.
Stay safe. Everybody, stay safe.
Okay, now what?
We're going
Oh,
one by
he's still there. Hey, buddy. Oh, he's gone. All right, and I am.